crime that has affected communities across the country over the last year and a half is unacceptable. That's why his administration is moving decisively to act with a whole-of-government approach. Today, the Biden-Harris administration is announcing a comprehensive strategy to combat violent crime and gun violence that targets the crime itself, implements preventative measures that are proven to reduce violent crime, and attacks root causes, including by addressing the flow of firearms used to commit crimes. Combined, this plan will stem the flow of firearms used to commit violence, including by holding rogue firearm dealers accountable for violating federal laws, support local law enforcement with federal tools and resources to help address violent crime, invest in evidence-based community violence interventions, expand summer programming, employment opportunities, and other services and support for teenagers and young adults, and help formerly incarcerated individuals successfully re-enter their communities. One of the key elements of this strategy is helping state and local governments fight gun violence and violent crime in their communities through the historic funding levels in the American Rescue Plan. Today's strategy builds on that by providing further guidance for states and cities to expand their ability to improve public safety in their communities, and we've already seen examples of what is happening around the country. In Philadelphia, Mayor Kenney is using funding from ARP to address gun violence, reform and improve the police department, and invest in violent interruption programs. In Albuquerque, Mayor Keller plans to spend $3 million to expand the city's gunshot detection system, and millions more to recruit police officers and refurbish station houses. In Akron, Ohio, Mayor Horgan has proposed $20 million to reduce community and youth violence through employment training and opportunities, as well as recreation assets. I'd also note today, and obviously the President will speak to all of this later this afternoon, today the Vice President will hold a listening session with leading civil rights and voting rights groups from across the country following the Senate vote on the For the People Act just yesterday. The meeting builds on the Vice President's work to bring together a national coalition on voting rights to promote voter registration and engagement among Americans across the country, from Greenville, South Carolina to Atlanta, Georgia, to protect our fundamental right to vote. She will drive the message that the fight is not over and that the President and the administration remain committed to ensuring that all Americans have access to the ballot. Finally, I do have one more thing. Tomorrow, the President will travel to Raleigh, North Carolina. Some of you may be on that trip, as our administration continues to work to continue encouraging vaccinations across the country, ensuring every American knows just how to ensure it is easy to get vaccinated. While he's there, he will highlight the importance of getting vaccinated and kick off a community canvassing event at the Green Road Park Community Center in Raleigh. He will also tour a mobile vaccination unit and meet with frontline workers and grassroots volunteers who are the boots on the ground working to get people in their communities vaccinated. Alex, why don't you kick us off?
Thanks, Jen. First off, the Vice President's office just announced that she'll be visiting the border Friday. What can you tell us about the visit? And you have in the past defended the decision not to visit the border by anyone, really, by President Biden or Vice President Harris. So what's behind the sort of change of course?
Sure. First, I think many of you may have seen it, but just to reiterate the specific details, the Vice President will travel to El Paso, Texas on Friday. She will be accompanied by Department of Homeland Security Secretary Allen Mayorkas. Earlier this year, as you all know, the President asked the Vice President to oversee our diplomatic efforts to address the root causes of migration from El Salvador to Guatemala and Honduras. And as a part of this work, she recently traveled to Guatemala and Mexico last month to have those discussions. And this trip to the border on Friday will be a part of this effort. I will note that I've also said here from this podium, and she has also said that when it was the right time, she may go to visit the border. And so this trip on Friday, which is being done in coordination with the Department of Homeland Security. Secretary Mayorkas is, of course, joining her on this trip, and the planning and timing of it was done in coordination with them, is part of the coordinated effort between her office, her work, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Health and Human Services, to continue to address the root causes and work in coordination to get the situation under control.
Sure. And then on voting rights, the President's statement yesterday said he'll have more to say on this next week. Mm-hmm. Can you give us a sense of what we should expect from the President on voting rights? And you also have said that there are other avenues for protecting voting rights. What do those look like? And then I'm going to take another stab at this. I know you've been asked this 5 different ways, but does the President believe that defending the filibuster is worth more and more important than protecting voting rights?
Well, first, let me say, as the Vice President said yesterday, and I'll just reiterate, the fight to improve and expand access to voting is far from over. And the President, as he noted in his statement yesterday, and as you just touched on, will be speaking to this next week. And this is a continuation of his efforts to use the bully pulpit to elevate this issue, as he did just last week when he marked Juneteenth, and also as he did in Tulsa, Oklahoma, just a few weeks before that. So I expect we'll have more to preview as we get closer, but I can tell you that what you should expect to hear from him is that there are many ways to work across the country with activists, with states, with legislators, using every lever at our disposal to expand access, improve access to voting for people across the country. He'll talk about some of the ways that he wants to continue to do that. He'll also reiterate his view that it's a fundamental right and that people across the country should be able to exercise that, to decide who they want to be their mayor, who they want to be their congressman, who they want to be their president. And everybody who supports democracy, who supports equality, who supports justice, should be supporting improvements to our voting rights laws.
And one more last one on this conversation around crime. How should the American people measure success for President Biden on crime? Should they be looking for a reduction in crime in their localities, or, I mean, what exactly is he aiming for in announcing these new policies today?
Well, that certainly is the goal, of course. But I would say, Alex, that what the president has watched closely is that there has been, of course, an increase in violent crime, gun violence specifically in a lot of communities over the last 18 months. He's obviously taken a number of steps over the past couple of months to work to address that. This is a continuation of that in his view. And part of that is empowering local police communities and making sure that local communities have the funding they need to support efforts by the local police. It also means taking steps to address the prevalence of gun violence across the country. So, of course, his objective is to take steps he can do as the President of the United States, using the tools he has at his disposal to empower local communities, get them the resources they need, and ensure we're putting laws in place that reduce gun violence. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jen. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the Vice President will be doing at the border? Is she visiting a detention center or a facility for migrant children? And how much access will the press have to whatever sites she tours while she's there?
They're all great questions. Obviously, they just made this announcement. I'm sure they will have more details to share with you. I just don't have any more to share with you at this particular moment on what she'll be doing specifically there.
Okay. And then can you tell us a little bit more about this decision for the U.S. to seize website domains used by Iranian state TV? What led to that decision and why now?
It's a Department of Justice decision and action, so I'd point you to them.
Is there any concern that this could hamper negotiations over Iran's nuclear program?
We are still at the point, and in those discussions, we just finished the sixth round. Obviously, all of the negotiators are back in their capitals, having discussions as is appropriate. We see advantage to us in moving toward a diplomatic solution. We hope others who have seats at the table do as well. But again, this was an action by the Department of Justice, not coordinated with other aspects of our negotiations.
And then what can you tell us about the talks that took place on the Hill yesterday over the bipartisan infrastructure proposal? Were those fruitful discussions, and where does that go from here? Is the president going to be hosting any of those senators here at the White House in the coming days?
If we continue to make progress in these discussions, then the president looks forward to welcoming members to the White House before the end of the week. We'll see. There were two rounds of discussions yesterday, and I know you're all aware of this, or many of you cover this closely, but there was one in the afternoon. There was another one last night. Additional progress was made last night. This afternoon, Steve Ricchetti, Louisa Terrell, Brian Deese are all back up on the Hill right about now, having continued discussions about the path forward. That's one track where we are moving forward on these bipartisan negotiations, and we assess as we conclude each round what the next step should be. So again, if we make progress and if we assess that it is the appropriate time to bring these officials, these elected officials to the White House, the president looks forward to doing that. Go ahead.
Thank you, Jen. So about today's announcement, why is the Vice President visiting the border this week? when earlier this month she dismissed a trip like that, saying it would be a grand gesture.
She also said in an interview with NBC that she would be open to going to the border if it was an appropriate time. She said that after she said that. So that's important context as well.
Okay, and important context, I've got the NBC interview right here. She was talking about how she hasn't been to the border, she hasn't been to Europe either. So does she think that these two things are the same?
And again, Peter, I think she also said in the same interview that she would be open to going to the border at an appropriate time. And what I'm conveying to you is that, as a part of her assignment, she has, of course, hosted a number of bilateral engagements. She's visited the Northern Triangle. She's made a number of announcements about how to address root causes that was going to assess with the Department of Homeland Security and with the administration when it was the appropriate time to go. And I will note that we're at this point in part because we've made a great deal of progress. And if you look just to a couple of months ago, when 6,000 children were in Border Patrol facilities, we're now at the point where there's far less than 1,000. If you look to just a couple of months ago, when there were children who were waiting in Border Patrol facilities for more than 100 hours, and they were certainly overcrowded, now it's less than 30 hours. In April, there were 22,000 kids in HHS facilities, and now that number is 14,000. Is there still more work to do? Absolutely. That's the purview of Secretary Mayorkas, but it's important every component of our government is coordinated.
Was it important for the White House to have her seen at the border before former President Trump has a trip there next week?
We made an assessment within our government about when it was an appropriate time for her to go to the border.
And then just one about the crime today. You mentioned expanding
the crime prevention rollout.
Prevention, yes, not the crime. But there is a lot of crime in big cities. How do you reduce?
Much of it caused by gun violence. Would you agree?
Yes. So how do you reduce gun violence by expanding employment opportunities, including summer jobs for young people?
Well, first, there's several components of this proposal. One of them is an initial set of actions on gun violence, or an additional set, I should say, of steps on gun violence, which the president feels are important to get guns off the streets, make sure they are not in the hands of people illegally, many of whom are playing a role in violent crime across the country. That's part of his objective. He also wants to provide, as we've seen, has been effective in communities across the country, incentives and alternatives for young people and communities where that has shown to be an effective step.
So is the thought there basically that some criminal who has been committing crimes with limited interruption or interference from police for the last couple of weeks or months is going to stop this easy life of crime if they have a summer job?
Well, I think the president believes that we shouldn't allow access to guns to those criminals who are currently illegally buying them from some dealers across the country. And part of his announcement is taking steps to do exactly that. But part of his announcement is also ensuring there's specific guidance to communities across the country to ensure that they have funding to get more community police around the country. Something that was supported by the American Jobs Plan that was voted into law by Democrats just a couple of months ago. Some might say that the other party was for defunding the police. I'll let others say that, but that's a piece. Go ahead.
Would you concede there is a political calculation to having the vice president visit the border before Donald Trump goes, and with a drumbeat from Republicans who have counted the days that she has not visited the border? Isn't there a political decision in the timing of this?
Well, Kelly, I would say that we have no way to predict what former President Trump will say when he goes to the border. We can only guess, but I don't think our view is that the vice president making a trip to the border with the Secretary of Homeland Security to assess and take a look at progress that's been made is going to prevent or change what the former president of the United States says when he goes to the border in a couple of days. Oh, go ahead. Did you have another question? Go ahead.
Senators, including Senator Tester, are saying that they believe they're at really the kind of razor's edge moment with deciding the pay-fors for infrastructure. Can they go forward? Do you feel that there is the possibility of some kind of a development within the next 24 hours? Would you agree with that sense of the timing? And is there anything new that the White House has offered for paying for these infrastructure programs that we have not learned of from you before?
Well, there's no question, as you know, it's much easier to negotiate with Congress when they're in session. So we're certainly hoping to make progress over the next couple of days. I'm not going to put it 24, 48. There's a couple more days in the week, and we're hopeful to make progress. If we see progress continue to be made between our discussions with our members of our senior team and members, then we look forward to welcoming Democrats and Republicans here to the White House to meet with the president. In terms of what we would offer, the president has offered a range of ways to pay for these proposals. And we've also we had so many options of how to pay for these proposals. We've even taken some of our own proposals off the table, including ensuring that individuals pay a higher rate for this specific negotiation, and also raising the corporate rate for this specific negotiation, even though we're keeping it on the table for later on to be very clear. But the bottom line, it's pretty clear and simple to the president. The choice for him on the pay-fors is, are you going to ask Americans who are just trying to go to work, just trying to drive their cars to work, drop their kids off at school, to pay more through a gas tax? Or should the wealthiest Americans pay what they owe in taxes? To him, that's a pretty clear no-brainer choice. That's part of the discussion, though. Go ahead.
Back to the president's crime prevention announcement today. You've noted that violent crime has been up over the last 18 months and several years. So what specifically prompted the president to come out and make this announcement today?
Well, there's a policy process that has been underway for the last couple of weeks and months even. We've had a series of announcements, as you know, over the past several months on gun violence prevention. Obviously, there was funding in the American Rescue Plan to support keeping cops on the street. And there are several components that were just prepared to be announced.
And you've made clear you're tackling this, as a gun issue. The president has urged Congress to take action on this. We've seen very little movement on the Hill. It's been years since we've seen sweeping gun reforms out of Washington. What is the president's message then to Americans who are concerned about rising crime in their communities? In order to achieve real progress, do they have to wait for Congress to act?
Well, the president would certainly like to see Congress act on universal background checks, on an assault weapons ban, a number of the pieces of legislation that are currently, I shouldn't say working their way through Congress, but are currently alive in Congress. But he's not going to wait. And his message to the American people is he's going to take steps that he has the power to take as president to reduce gun violence, to put in place measures that will reduce the likelihood of criminals having access to guns on the streets. There are authorities any president has, and he's going to take steps to do that, even as he pushes for legislation to move forward.
So beyond the announcements today, he is preparing or considering additional steps that could tackle some of these issues?
Well, I think we're going to focus on the announcements he's making today, a lot of which are on gun violence and gun violence prevention measures. I don't have anything beyond that to preview, but there are some significant steps he's certainly announcing this afternoon.
And just one more question on how the funding for all of this works. You're allowing state and local governments to reallocate some of the COVID-19 relief funds to hire more police officers, invest in other areas to combat this rising crime. But when Republicans pitched that idea to try and pay for some of an infrastructure plan, the White House said that money was already allocated. So what's the difference?
Well, the money was always allocated in state and local authority to state and local governments. One of the authorities they could always have taken was to ensure there were more cops on the beat, more police in place, and that's something we have always said was a part of the plan and the proposal. I don't know why Republicans opposed that or why that would have prompted them to vote against the package. Go ahead.
Just to follow up on Mary's first question, public safety can be a potent political issue. To what degree, if any, has the politics played a role in the decision to really try and get out in front of things today?
Well, the president has been very consistent in his views over the course of decades. He has never been for defunding the police. He has always been a supporter of ensuring that local community policing is funded and adequately supported by the federal government. He's also been a longtime advocate for decades and leader on addressing gun violence. So this is actually a continuity of his leadership on these issues over the course of decades. Now he has taken steps since president on each of these issues as well, including supporting funding, proposing funding in his own budget for community policing. And this is just an opportunity to put additional meat on the bones.
And then two more quick ones. You've answered this before, but just to make sure I understand red lines in the elusive search for pay-fors that are amenable to everybody. User fees on electric vehicles, is that in the same category as indexing the gas tax from your guys' perspective in these negotiations?
Yes, we are not for a Ford F-150 tax. I'm not sure why others are.
Good for you. And then quickly, given the tempo of some of the Taliban offensives that we've seen in Afghanistan, are there contingency plans at work right now to either move troops out faster, or perhaps more importantly, embassy officials, folks that the U.S. plan to keep on the ground if they advance much quicker than perhaps was initially thought?
Well, first I would say that our Department of Defense is overseeing an orderly withdrawal of our troops from Afghanistan, and doing that at a pace that, in their view, will ensure their safety and ensure we are doing it in a way that's effective and in a coordinated manner with the government. I will say that while in general we are seeing elevated attacks on DSF and Afghan government versus a year ago, we have not seen an increase in attacks on our military or presence since February 2020. And we also assess that had we not begun to draw down, violence would have increased against us as well after May 1st, because that was what the Taliban was clearly conveying. So the status quo, in our view, was not an option. In terms of personnel and others on the ground, that's certainly something that our State Department and our team takes very seriously and assesses whether there is a need to take any additional action. And I would certainly defer to them on any additional preview they do on that front. Go ahead.
Thank you, Jen. We understand that the administration plans to replace the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac's federal regulator after the Supreme Court ruling that has now made it easier for the president to install his preferred overseer. Do you have a comment on that?
That's correct, given the Supreme Court ruling this morning, but I don't have any timeline for you on when that nomination will be made.
Are there any preferred candidates?
I don't have any candidates to preview. When we're ready to announce one, we will announce one.
Okay. And any comment on on Russia firing warning shots and dropping bombs to chase a British warship out of the waters? Moscow now claims that in the Black Sea that they claim belongs to Russia.
I would point you to the British. We don't have any more comment on it from here.
And one question on voting rights. We've been kind of talking to a lot of voting rights and civil rights activists who are saying that the president isn't just simply doing enough on the issue and is betraying black voters who actually helped him get into the office by not doing absolutely everything he can. And he's instead spending his time negotiating infrastructure with Republicans. How would you respond to that criticism?
Who's saying that?
A lot of civil rights activists and voting activists.
Like who?
We've spoken to several groups and outfits. I mean, I can reach out to you with names after the briefing.
Sure. That sounds good. Okay, go ahead.
Thanks, Jen. A number of lawmakers have asked the administration to extend the federal moratorium on evictions, which expires at the end of the month. Is that something the administration is considering, and why or why not?
Sure. Well, let me first say that would be a decision. The decision to extend the eviction moratorium will be made by the CDC based on public health conditions, and we certainly wouldn't get ahead of their assessment. As you know, the eviction moratorium expires on June 30th, hence I think your question. It was always intended to be temporary, and the president remains focused on ensuring that Americans who are struggling through no fault of their own have an off-ramp once it ends. Hence, we've also worked to take additional steps to ensure people are getting the support they need to stay in their homes, whether they are renters or homeowners. But we'd certainly defer to the CDC on their decision and their timeline. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jen. The Miami Police Chief, Art Acevedo, expressed concern, disappointment that his association wasn't invited to the discussion. His association represents dozens of the largest city police forces, the major cities chief association. I just wanted to ask why the group wasn't invited, considering the role that they would likely be part of it.
Well, I think as we were putting together the roundtable that the president is taking part in today, we tried to have a diverse group of individuals representing a range of interests from across the country who have all played an active and vital role in addressing crime and crime prevention across the country. It is not meant to diminish anyone, including the individual you mentioned, and I'm sure we will be closely engaged with them and others who are not a part of this roundtable.
One more question
Sure.
on the crime and gun prevention effort. This effort involves redirecting some of the relief aid to these measures, and it gives wide latitude for spending that money in certain areas. But the Biden administration largely opposed redirecting relief funds for infrastructure projects. There were some limited exceptions, water and sewer, but why was it not okay for infrastructure or limited for infrastructure, but it is more okay for this area?
I think this is similar to the question Mary just asked. I mean, it has always been the case that ensuring funding was used by state and local authorities to keep cops on the beat was always a part of what was allowed in the parameters of the spending. And that is something that a number of communities, as I outlined at the beginning, did take the steps to do. So this is just giving additional guidance on how to use the funds. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jen. On the meeting later today between Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and White House officials, what is the White House's message to them going to be with regard to the infrastructure talks? So you're going to insist on continuing going down the bipartisan route, or is this going to be a decision point where they may sort of kick the tires and go ahead with reconciliation on that?
Well, we've always seen this, or seen this for some time, I should say, not always, as a two-track strategy, right? So there are different discussions and negotiations happening today. One track, the American Jobs Plan, or big components of it, is a part of the infrastructure negotiations that we're discussing. Steve Ricchetti, Louisa Terrell, Brian Deese, right now with members who are part of that bipartisan discussion. Later tonight is a discussion that will also include Shalanda Young, also include Susan Rice and others. That's a discussion in part about the budget reconciliation process, the second track. And that track will include the American Families Plan and components that are not a part of the negotiation. So we've been saying two tracks. Today is an example of two tracks actually moving forward at one time in one day.
Which track is moving more smoothly right now?
They're both moving at a rapid pace. They're both moving. We know that we're at a later stage, obviously, in the bipartisan negotiations. You all know that. And obviously, we want to make progress over the next couple of days. We're in an earlier stage of the budget reconciliation process. That's because that's how that process works. But it's important to keep both tracks going.
And then just one more for